Welcome, everybody, to another economics social studies lesson with Mr. Regas. We've had a couple lessons introducing some basic, fundamental concepts of economics. This includes some of our, the differences between microeconomics, macroeconomics, supply and demand, capitalism, communism, our big economic questions, monetary policy, fiscal policy. These foundations were laid quite a long time ago. People like Adam Smith, he wrote The Wealth of Nations in the year 1776. So that's a long time ago. Still relevant, but it's a long time ago. What we're going to be moving into in our course is looking at economic globalization in the 20th and 21st century, because it's in the 20th century, especially after or post World War II, that the world's economy really becomes the interconnected thing or entity that it is today. I'm going to skim over some of the material in this reading that you'll complete on your own. I'll elaborate on some points. So let's get started. So how did 20th century world events shape contemporary economic globalization? Well, 1914. Colonialism and imperialism is at full swing. European empires control great wealth, territory, most of the world. People wanted to protect these colonies, source of raw materials and markets for goods. This is one of the things that ends up leading into World War One. That's something you'll learn more about in Social 20. World War One, when it happened, was the most destructive war in human history. Over 15 million soldiers and civilians killed. Canada lost more than 66,000. Canadian, French, Russian, British, Australian, German, South African, Indian soldiers. They were participating in this war. Long story short, the economic costs of the war were extremely high. Wars cost money, and a lot of Western Europe and parts of Eastern Europe were destroyed. That's not exaggeration. They were literally destroyed. And so governments had to rebuild somehow, right? So a lot of them borrowed heavily from the United States, and so they owed the United States for this, but economies were devastated. 1919, world production of manufactured goods is more than 25% lower than it had been in 1913. In Russia, that production had dropped 80%. So after the war, many countries restricted international trade while they tried to rebuild. This is one of the things that we see really escalating the Great Depression. We'll get to that. So the cost of peace. Well, when World War I ended, the world wanted peace, right? They didn't want to go into another world war. So negotiators at these peace conferences, such as the Paris Peace Conference where they signed the Treaty of Versailles, they decided, and these were the winning countries in World War I, that Germany was going to have to pay what's called reparations. Now, these are payments for war damages that were incurred in Britain, France, Russia, and other countries. Some people warned against these reparations and said that they were too severe. One of the people who argued against them is John Maynard Keynes. We'll talk about him later. The arguments against reparations was that this money that they owed was going to cripple their economy. The issue of reparations is an extremely interesting one, and I explore it much more fully in World War II. So if you want to learn more about reparations, feel free to watch the Causes of World War II video that I've made already. Germany also had to give up colonies. They didn't get independence like you might think would be the morally proper thing to do. Instead, they just went to other countries. Next up, we have the Russian Revolution. At the end of World War I, Russia enters a revolution which pushes Russia into a civil war. Essentially, what happens is this is another destructive war going on in Russia, which causes them to sign a peace treaty with Germany, leave World War I, and then they are torn apart by civil war until 1922. So we see more starvation, we see transportation systems broken down, civil war killing people. a drought and famine killing at least 5 million people. So Russia's quite heavily like destroyed during this. But what emerges out of the Russian Revolution and Civil War is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, so the USSR or the Soviet Union. This is the world's first communist state. We've talked about communism, so you already have an understanding of what it is. Soviet Union becomes a one-party state. It's led by Vladimir Lenin. After he dies, Joseph Stalin takes power. Power is absolute here. So these are authoritarian states. And when Joseph Stalin takes power, what he tries to do is transform the country's economy and make the Soviet Union into an industrial and military giant. They did this through production schedules for farms and industries. So people had to work in factories, mines, and we see the process of collectivization, another concept that isn't new to us in this course. So things being grown for the group, by the group, for the group. Now, theoretically, the wheat that they grew would go to the collective state and then be redistributed. This is not at all what happened. This is where we see one of those first major failures of communism. Major is taking it lightly. We see over 5 million Ukrainians dying in famine between 1932 and 1933. Little side note about famine, famines are always uh, stoppable at any stage. There's some interesting work done on this. Amartya Sen is one individual who's written extensively about famines. Essentially, a, now his argument is that a famine has never occurred in a democratic state with things like multi-party elections, free press, because what we see going on in places like the Soviet Union in 1932, they did not have a food shortage. Instead of redistributing the food to the people who were growing it, though, Stalin exported it to other countries to help pay for the industrialization taking place. And so literally millions die. Now that's the 20s, or we kind of talked a little bit about there. We're going through this quick. During the 20s, countries were in an economic boom. This is called the Roaring Twenties by some people. Now I'm going to put a link to a video to watch. It's kind of funny depicting the Roaring Twenties. Essentially, unemployment is low. Stock exchanges are doing really well. Now, a stock exchange is a place where people buy and sell shares in publicly traded companies. If you have a share in a company, you are part owner. Now, what that means is the amount of money you get from your share is dependent on a couple things. If the company is doing extremely well and people want those shares, so the demand is high, the price of them is going to increase. So if you decide one day to sell your share, you're going to make a lot of money. Some companies that offer public shares also pay things called dividends, where every year the amount of profit that is made in that company, they take some of that and they pay the people who own shares in the company. Anyway, the New York Stock Exchange, one of the biggest in the world, prices started going down at the end of the 20s. Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. This day is known as Black Tuesday. There's a lot of reasons for the stock exchange crashes. One of the things that was happening in the United States at the time, leading up to 1929 October, there were things like housing booms in parts of the country, like Florida was having a huge housing boom in the 20s. What we see is things like banks who, if you remember when we talk about monetary policy, banks have money to give to people to use. That's one of the ways banks make money as well. You put your money in a bank, they use that to make more money. So people, like the money you can get from a bank, we call that credit. In the 20s, the bank was giving out tons and tons of credit, especially for things like housing. The problem is eventually people are taking so much credit out that they have to start borrowing more money just to pay the interest on that. These are those bubbles that you might hear people talk about. So the bubble grows and grows and then it bursts. it's a it's inevitable that these burst because the rate of borrowing is not what's the word I'm looking for? You can't do it forever. I'm having a mind blank right now. Anyway, so on Tuesday, October 29th, the stock market crashed. Those bubbles burst. Banks did not have the amount of money they could keep giving out anymore. Sustainable, that's the word I'm looking for. Because the unsustainable borrowing that was happening, people started to realize, oh, banks aren't going to be able to do this forever. So some people start to pull their money out, which leads to more people doing that, which leads to the banks having less money to give, which means people aren't getting money to spend. It's a snowball effect. The stock market crashed. When something like this happens, and this has been happening due to the COVID-19 pandemic as well, shares plummet. Companies become less valuable. And so, as people see the value of their shares go down, they want to try to save as much of the money as they have in those shares as they can. So, they take that money out, and it just gets worse and worse and worse because of that. So, this chain reaction ends up leading to the Great Depression. There's also money that has been borrowed from other countries in Europe. So, they're experiencing things like this too. For example, in the 20s in Germany, they were hoping that when they beat France in World War I, they would be able to get France to pay them reparations, which would pay for all the money Germany borrowed to pay for the war. France, on the other hand, they actually introduced their first income tax to pay for World War I. So they didn't owe money the same way Germany did, but their economy was crushed because of the war. Anyway, we see things like unemployment rising, demand decreasing, and those things feed into each other, causing more and more cuts and more people losing their jobs. So the whole world moves into an economic depression. What we see in this depression is countries trying to protect their own industries. So people throw up trade barriers, which includes tariffs on imports, so taxes on imports, trying to get people to only buy what's within their country. So international trade declines, more people lose their jobs. Another thing that countries are doing in the early 30s is they're trying to lower the value of their currency. And we're going to be talking about currency a bit today. So I'll introduce this now because the worth of your currency or the value of your currency determines the price of your goods. If Canada's dollar is doing extremely well and is worth a ton of money, all the things that different countries buy from Canada are more expensive. So countries in the early 30s were trying to lower the value of their currency to make their goods cheaper. But this was like a race to the bottom, and all these countries start sinking each other. This happens in a free market economy. It's not growing at a constant state. It goes through this series of booms and busts. So this is a business cycle. So what we're looking at on this graph here is that economies grow and then they will shrink a bit. A smaller shrinking period would be called a recession. Then you have this period of prosperity with a peak. A really big drop with usually a long recovery would be a depression. I'm going to let you read through the explanation of this. Now we're going to introduce two of our thinkers right now, John Maynard Keynes and Friedrich Hayek. These are two of the most influential people of the 20th century. Without a doubt, that would be the case. They have very opposing views, though, as far as how the economy should work. Keynes, he wanted government activism. He believed that the government should be involved even in a free market economy. We'll talk about that more later. Friedrich Hayek, he called the state Cassandra. This is a warning that's not taken seriously. So he warned that the state had destructive potential. If the state got too powerful, it would lead to totalitarianism. He said, look at Nazi Germany and Stalinist Soviet Union. So they had very different viewpoints on what the role of the government or the state is. Yet despite their differences, both men were committed to the defense of Western civilization. and both were determined that the West would do better than it had last time in laying the foundations of a lasting peace. So, who's correct? People are still debating this, and we still see their influence today. I'll talk about that more later. After the Great Depression, we have World War II. Essentially, there's 10 years of extremely hard economic growth or low economic growth or shrinking. Unemployment reaches 25%. I'm summing over a lot of stuff in the Great Depression, but in 1939, World War II starts with Adolf Hitler invading Poland, and this starts to bring countries out of the Great Depression because to pay for or to go to war, you need to have your industries really working full time. So Hitler's popular. He convinces Germans they belong to this master race, they should rule other people. This brings the whole world into this war. World War II is much more destructive than World War One. It says here 60 million, it's more like 75 million people died, including the Holocaust and the Holodomor and other famines. So World War II is just, it's beyond destructive. Germany suffers, China suffers, USSR. Death camps in Germany, we see between 10 and 26 million people potentially killed. Jewish people, Polish people, Czechs, Greeks, Roma, Serbs, Ukrainians, Russians, as well as homosexuals or people with mental and physical disabilities and others as well. And so after both World War One and World War Two, we're looking at a period of about 25 years, 30 years, the two most destructive wars in human history. About 100 million people dead between the two of them, economies just ravished. Now the world thinks we do not want World War III. The things we did wrong after World War One, let's try to not make those mistakes again. And this is where we see the foundations of contemporary global economics being laid. So, representatives of Britain, United States, Canada, and other countries, specifically countries who were on the Ally side here, they decide they should make an organization that would support people who want to choose their own government, so self government, help countries cooperate on trade issues, protect smaller countries against invasion by larger countries, and ensure that no single country controlled the world's oceans. The organization they built is the United Nations. The Charter of the UN opens with these words: "We, the people of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, do hereby establish an international organization to be known as the United Nations." Today, there's 193 countries that are a part of the United Nations. And so, this is one of the things that we start to see entering the new kind of economic order. So, let's talk about Bretton Woods for a bit. Bretton Woods is a place, but in New Hampshire, but it was a conference in 1944. So 10 months before Germany surrendered, 15 months before Japan surrendered. John Maynard Keynes is leading this, and they had a few ideas that came out of it. So they wanted to revive world trade when the war ended, stabilize currencies, and deal with war debts and frozen credit markets. So a frozen credit market, if something's frozen, you'd think of it as like the funds aren't there, and credit means borrowing, so people couldn't borrow, right? So they wanted to fix that. They wanted to be able to have countries earn their way back to prosperity. So Bretton Woods was to rebuild and reconstruct Europe through intergovernment involvement. Inter meaning they work together. This was a move away from the laissez-faire or the hands-off approach. The Bretton Woods system of monetary management established the rules for commercial and financial relations. There's also a need to address the lack of cooperation among other countries and to prevent competitive devaluation of the currencies as well. So, how are they going to do this? Well, they have to build a new international monetary system. So after Bretton Woods, and they have their three goals, they come up with an idea for procedures for the post war global economy. They establish a new international monetary system. So they have a global network of institutions to promote international trade and the regulation of currency. So one of the things that comes out of this is what's called the gold standard. We'll explain this a little bit here. So during the Bretton Woods Conference, the 44 countries there agreed to a common monetary policy or system where each country would maintain a fixed exchange rate for its currency. So if you have a fixed exchange rate, that means the value of a country's currency is set by the government and it doesn't move. They also agreed that this would be based on the gold standard. What this means is the amount of money that a government printed, so things like, you open your wallet and you have a $5 bill, so that type of printed money had to be convertible to gold and could be cashed in at any time for gold. What this means, though, is that a country could not print more money than what they had in gold in like a vault somewhere. Historically, these things were important because it gave people confidence. If you're walking around with money in your wallet, you want to make sure that that value of that money doesn't decrease. Gold is seen as having something like real value, and so it gave people that confidence. It also limited the amount of currency a country could have. Now, we'll give some examples on this stuff later, but the system it never really worked in modern economies though. So when a country is limited to printing money up to the value of their gold reserves, it limits what you can do. It kind of limits economic growth. And we'll talk about that later. And the next thing is called floating exchange rates. So these fixed exchange rates that come out of the Bretton Woods conference, they last for a while. This gold standard lasts for a couple decades. By the 1960s, though, the US is facing high inflation. So they have the Vietnam War, massive new social programs. So the price of goods is really increasing. So in 1971, President Richard Nixon decided to stop following the gold standard. So he said they closed the gold window by making the dollar inconvertible to gold directly, except on the open market, so the foreign exchange market. What this means is that the US dollar was no longer redeemable for gold by the US government. 5 years later, 1976, all the world's major currencies now had floating exchange rates. So, what this means is that the exchange rate of a country's currency is no longer fixed by a government. This is where we see those concepts like supply and demand coming into play. The value of a currency is based on the foreign exchange market. So the amount of people that want your money, that will determine what the value of it is. Now, the way this works is, let's say Japan buys something from Canada. Well, they then get Canadian dollars. And then that has to be converted. So countries end up with these different amounts of each other's money. And that's what affects floating exchange rates. Now, this whole concept of money is kind of interesting. We'll talk more about that later. Some countries also, when we have floating exchange rates, they try to keep their exchange rates low. China practiced this for quite a while because it made their products cheaper on the foreign market. So the Bretton Woods exchange rate system saw all currencies linked to the dollar linked to gold. This made capital flows severely restricted. But we saw 2 decades of rapid economic growth, and there weren't really any financial crises. So, fixed exchange rates, you had that obligation to a monetary policy, and this gave the IMF the power to bridge temporary imbalances of payments. There's also a need to address the lack of cooperation among other countries. So in short, they wanted stability and cooperation. So back to Bretton Woods. For the West, Bretton Woods meant avoiding the mistakes of the interwar era. Keynes decided, and he was thinking, economic stability was a key to political stability. That's an extremely important concept here. The belief was that if countries are doing well economically, if they're growing, people are getting more money, then we will see political stability. And so this is needed for that long run survival of the West to avoid another war. So we see out of this come a couple organizations. Two of the important ones, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Again, these are intergovernmental organizations, not NGOs. What the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, or the WB, they are represented by governments. And so it's governments working together. So Keynes envisioned a United Nations of international finance that would provide a framework for cooperation as global lender of last resort and judge of trade disputes. They'd operate with rules and procedures to try to prevent financial crises, trade wars, and depressions such as those in the interwar era. So the World Bank and the IMF. This Venn diagram gives you an idea of what both organizations do and did. Now, the goals of them changed a little bit. The World Bank was essentially supposed to help war-torn countries rebuild after World War II. The IMF, their goals were to make sure that exchange rates were dependable, convertible to gold. These have changed though. Currently, the World Bank, their goals, things like increasing growth, reducing poverty in developing nations, also funding specific infrastructure projects. The IMF, they provide emergency short-term loans to countries. Right now, during the middle of this coronavirus pandemic and economic crisis happening in the world, the IMF has been giving billions and billions of dollars to countries to try to help them ease the pain of this economic crisis. Now, both of these organizations, they're both headquartered in Washington, D.C. That's important here. Both established by international treaty, they both fall under the control of the UN. They both agree on rules about how countries deal with monetary affairs, though, and they also try to govern international trade and finance. Now, some thinkers believe that, in this free trade, but Keynes didn't believe that the world naturally tends towards peace and progress. He believed that international cooperation was required because the alternative was war. So Allied political leaders also learned from experience that peace depended on economic revival. So as President Franklin Roosevelt put it, economic diseases are highly communicable. It follows, therefore, that the economic health of every country is a proper matter of concern to all its neighbors, near and distant. So the Bretton Woods Conference was Keynes' idea, and Keynes was in charge during it. Now, let's get into Hayek a little bit. So, en route to the Bretton Woods Conference, Keynes read The Road to Serfdom. This was written by Friedrich Hayek. So Hayek disagrees with Keynes. During World War I, Hayek had been a corporal in the Austro-Hungarian army, and in the years that followed, he was a university student in Vienna. He was once a moderate socialist, but he grew disillusioned with central planning when he witnessed the new Austrian state and hyperinflation destroy the middle class's faith in democracy. Now, hyperinflation is when the value of your money decreases so quickly and the prices increase so much. You see things like countries just printing money. In Germany in the early 20s, when they had hyperinflation, they had like $1 trillion or trillion mark bills because a loaf of bread would cost in the trillions. Right, so your value of money is just nothing. And so Hayek wrote a book warning Western intellectuals that, and this, is based on anecdotal evidence from his country's history, that the road to totalitarianism, whether of Hitler or Stalin's variety, it started on the slippery slope of well-intentioned government interference in the private sector. So when the government gets involved in the market, this is a slippery slope to them getting more and more involved, eventually leading to totalitarianism. So you can look up that term, totalitarianism. Now, after reading The Road to Serfdom, Keynes writes to Hayek and he says, morally and philosophically, I find myself in agreement with virtually the whole of it. And not only in agreement, but deeply moved agreement. He then proceeded to lay out his profound disagreement. According to my ideas, you greatly underestimate the practicability of the middle course. What we want is not no planning or even less planning. Indeed, I should say that we almost certainly want more. So again, Keynes is arguing for that government intervention in the economy. Now, the ideas of the two of them, Keynes and Hayek, they influenced the 20th century to a great degree. Now, this is for some reason not saying anything, so let's just adapt it. So, who wins? Well, some people would say Keynes technically won in the battle of the two of them, at least between 1945 and the 1970s. So, we see a lot of government intervention in the economy in this time period. You also see the development of things like social welfare programs. So the Great Depression taught people that, oh, maybe some government intervention is important. Again, relate that to the current day coronavirus pandemic. As soon as this started, countries were giving money to individuals and businesses. This was because the Great Depression taught us if you don't have money going into the economy still, it's going to shrink. Now, in the end, fixed exchange rates and the gold standard, they ended up proving too inflexible to deal with money or to deal with the rising economic power of Germany and Japan, America's reluctance to adjust its domestic economic policy to maintain the gold peg. So Nixon, he cancels the gold standard. They call this the Nixon shock. And these measures, they didn't formally abolish the existing Bretton Woods system, but the suspension of one of the key components rendered the Bretton Woods system dead. So by 1973, the Bretton Woods system was replaced and based on freely floating fiat currencies. Now, fiat means it's not convertible or fixed in value. So the money here gets its value from supply and demand. Fiat also means it's legal tender. So that is what like your government prints. So that's the legal money here. So it's valuable because other people are willing to take the money in exchange for goods and services. Because again, otherwise it would be worth the value of paper, which it's printed on, and then that doesn't do any good. Now, during all this Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate regime, the world was very stable. There was no major economic crisis reported between 1950 and 1973. This is not happening within the new system. Every 4 years or so, there's been a major economic crisis. We have seen many in the past couple decades. So the Bretton Woods restrictions were enforced in most major capitalist economies during this era. They call this the golden age of the American economy, 30 glorious years. So the American and world economies performed better in this period than ever before since. If we bring back the capital controls of the Bretton Woods system, we necessarily force the world back towards much more balanced trade. However, the downside of this is that countries forfeit control of their monetary policy. So countries with fixed exchanges must embrace the monetary policy of their currency sponsor. So in short, this is a loss of sovereignty and control and freedom. So what sort of changes happened? By the 70s, some governments were spending so much on expanding their economy, they built up huge debts. In addition, inflation was rising, so was unemployment. According to Keynes' theories, though, these things were not supposed to happen at the same time. You weren't supposed to have unemployment and inflation occurring at the same time. Inflation usually is caused by there being too much money in the economy. So having unemployment and inflation was disproving some of Keynes's theories. In this new economic environment, the views of Hayek and his student and colleague Milton Friedman start to gain support. By 1974, Hayek's ideas had become so popular he shared the Nobel Prize in economics. Friedman won the award 2 years later. So their ideas are that markets, not the government, should control a country's economy. Now, supporters of Milton Friedman's view have called him the most influential economist of the second half of the 20th century. This isn't really argued by many people. As a young man, Friedman supported theories of Keynes but changed his mind in the 50s and eventually spearheaded the opposition to Keynes. Friedman became the chief spokesperson of a group of economists that became known as the Chicago School, after the University of Chicago, where he taught. Friedman believed that everyone would experience greater prosperity as well as more political and social freedom if there was less government control and freer markets. He believed that communism and socialism represented the extreme of government control. At the other extreme, he said, people were free to make their own choices with a minimum of government control. In Friedman's view, the system that would give people the greatest freedom to buy whatever they wanted, sell whatever they wanted, was a system that also provided the best chance of prosperity. In tough economic times, Friedman said, people should not expect to rely on government help. He believed that it was not the government's role to support people through hard times. Rather, he said people would be better off if they learned to adapt to changes in the market and the demand for their goods and services. Now, there's a lot of truth and there's a lot of good things coming out of Friedman's views, and there's been a lot of research on things like freedoms and what this does for economic growth and prosperity of individuals. It also, though, doesn't take into consideration inherent differences that people have, things like lived experiences, right? You have years and years or hundreds of years of privilege, some people being able to build up vast amounts of wealth, pass that down generationally, while others have been exploited. This These sort of things aren't taken into consideration with these viewpoints. And so sometimes some people get left behind then. But Hayek and Friedman, they believe that less government intervention and free markets would generate economic health. These theories become extremely influential, especially with British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and US President Ronald Reagan. So what we see is in kind of the late 70s, early 80s, Britain and the US begin to move towards a market economy. So people are freer to make their own decisions. There's little government intervention, resources are the private property of people or companies. The debate, though, between these two differing economic visions continues to reverberate in the world today. Canada, for example, has continued to maintain a mixed economy in which both the public and private sectors play a significant role. Some resources are privately owned, but others are publicly owned. So most countries in the world follow a similar model. Interestingly enough, even if you go back and read Adam Smith, kind of that godfather of economics and the market economy, even he supports the decision or supports having public education. So it's interesting that even those early free market thinkers still believe in some public policies. So in the years after World War II, US and Soviet Union become economic and military superpowers. Capitalism and democracy versus communism and a central government. This is a source of friction for decades. This is called the Cold War, and it lasts until December 31st, 1991. At this point, Soviet Union ceases operation, and essentially you could say that capitalism wins and comes out on top. So the debate persists today. Keynes versus Hayek, free market versus protectionism. The Great Recession of 2008, we see stimulus spending versus austerity. Now it's worth talking a little bit about the Great Recession here. So this was somewhat caused by, well, different countries having some different reasons, but a lot of it was a housing crisis. So mortgage-backed securities. So banks were buying or getting mortgages, and then firms were buying these mortgage-backed securities. Similar to the 20s, you see this unsustainable growth. People not actually really being able to afford the houses they're being given. There's more reasons than that. But 2008, the stock market crashes again. So we see, the economy shrink. It goes into a recession. Unemployment hits 10%, but this is compared to 25% in the Great Depression. What we see, though, in things like the Great Recession or today in the coronavirus pandemic, those theories of Keynes become quite influential. So this is where stimulus versus austerity comes into play. Stimulus spending, similar to what it sounds like, it's about pumping money into the economy to try to stimulate it to grow again. In 2008, we saw this with things like huge bailouts to your big banks in the trillions of dollars. Austerity, the difference here is it's kind of like you tighten your belt, right? You're not going to eat as much. So you have your fiscal austerity means you're not going to spend as much money either. And so these are some of the differences between the two, and they're quite interesting. Anyway, this is just a quick little optional thing for you to do here. Create a timeline of these events with a quick summary. But these are some of those foundations of current economic policies and economic globalization. So, hope you enjoyed. We'll talk more about this later. Thanks.